Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Alicia Metter. I'm a project coordinator at the Rockford office for Quest Global, and I am also a champion for culture. Quest Global's Horizon podcast, we explore the concept of cultural debt and its profound impact on organizational sustainability. Drawing parallels with technical debt, we examine how cultural shortcuts, delayed decisions, and postponed investments in organizational health can accumulate over time, affecting a company's long-term viability. Our discussion explores the techniques for measuring, monitoring, and managing cultural debt while building sustainable organizational practices that really can help companies thrive for centuries to come. So I'm very excited to get started today. We have our host, Courtney Headley, who is the Global Head of Culture at Quest Global. Courtney leads initiatives to build and maintain a strong, welcoming organizational culture. His expertise lies in developing frameworks for measuring and enhancing cultural health with a particular focus on creating sustainable organizational practices. And also our guest, Dashi Reddy, who is the Chief Business Officer at Quest Global. With extensive experience in organizational leadership and business transformation, Dashi brings valuable insights into balancing business growth with cultural sustainability. So welcome, Courtney and Dashi. I am so excited for you both to be here, and I'm very excited to kind of hear your take on this topic of cultural debt. And to kind of get that started, Dashi, I'm going to, go for you first here, but how would you define cultural debt?
Thank you, Alicia. Uh, Cultural debt is much like a financial debt. If I explain in the terms of financial terms, debt can be a strategic tool, but when taken for a short-term comfort without a ROI, it becomes a burden. Cultural debt work in the same way. It builds up when leaders overlook values or sideline well-being to chase near-term metrics. Example, let me take an example
Yeah.
of giving a feedback. If we avoid giving clear, honest, direct feedback because we don't want to rock the boat, we essentially are doing more harm than good. That is cultural debt piling up. And over time, all these little compromises compound. You will end up with a team that is misaligned and momentum stalls. Here is a shift. Let us treat culture like an asset we are investing in. Courtney, your take?
Yeah, I really appreciate that take, Dishi, on what cultural debt is all about. I'd like to build on that a little bit and maybe spotlight some of the indicators that might give some sign that cultural debt might be accumulating in an organization. And I think when we talk about the topic of culture, it always, for me, starts with leadership. And I'm a firm believer that leaders set the tone in the organization. They set the tone with respect to culture. And I think when you see signs of cultural debt starting to creep in, you see an absence of leadership. You see an absence of leaders actually consciously making an effort to set the right tone culturally across the organization. You see an overall lack of engagement across the organization. In other words, people have kind of checked out without actually telling you that they've checked out. That bleeds over and carries over into business performance and being able to sustain that performance over time. So there's so many indicators that would give you a sign that cultural debt is starting to become an issue. And I think for me, there's a quote by Mahatma Gandhi that talks about the culture resides in the hearts and the minds of the people of a country. Paraphrasing there, but I think the same holds true when we talk about an organization's culture. When cultural debt is present and becoming an issue, you see it in the behaviors, you see it in the actions, you see it in the words, you see it in how people think. So just a little bit of a build on how you define cultural debt, Dishi.
No, I was going to say, like having that, you're right, Courtney, having that strong leadership is so important, and it's oftentimes kind of, rare to find a true leader. But when you do notice one, or you take notice, or, you're able to kind of work with one, it really, it really makes you want to kind of, follow that leader. And so thanks for sharing that though.
Just to add on to that, Alicia and Courtney, the definition of culture that I resonate the most is by Daniel Coyle, and he defines culture as set of living relationships working towards a shared mission. I think that shared mission is a key word. And years back, I remember working with a global team in Europe on an engineering project. When somebody new joined into the team, joined this brainstorming session we were having, their debate seemed like chaos and overlapping voices, table pounding debates, intense stares, not a smooth flowing conversation. I vividly remember this new joiner saying, "Hey, there looks like there are team challenges and team dynamics issues." But underneath all that debate, you find the deep trust, psychological safety, and a shared mission. That team, as I observed, excelled over the next 2 decades. So, if you contrast with that example, the three key signs of cultural debt accumulating is a lack of aspiration or weaker bonds of belongingness and the limited vulnerability, fearless open dialogue or fear of openly expressing, and that slows the learning process. These are the warning signs to watch out.
And so as we talk about, what it is and what the signs are, what are, I should say, like how can organizations effectively measure and, like monitor their cultural health? And Dashi,
Yeah,
do you
great.
want to take that one?
Yeah, that's a great question. And culture may be invisible, but in my view, it is measurable. I believe a few indicators that can give a real-time visibility. One, the language patterns. When something becomes part of the language, it becomes part of the thinking. The words carry mindset, and the patterns are telling. So insights come from the charts or minutes of the meeting or the transcripts, that when you deeply look into it, do you see curiosity? Do you see ownership? Do you see that hunger and the humility? Or are you seeing defensive language? That actually tells a lot. And the technology can do wonders in terms of measuring the culture, also microcultures. And second thing is goal setting behavior. This is actually essentially what, when I talk to the teams, are the goals, where are these goals coming from? The why behind goals tells a lot. Are they rooted in the fear of aspiration? Are they playing to win? Right? So when teams stretch with that belief, that's the winning culture. And also another important thing is collision hours. How often, the way I call collision hours is how often people engage in a meaningful mission based dialogue. So, if you have to explain the whole cultural balance, it is a function of aspiration intensity, bonds of belongingness, and the collision hours at different proportions based on how organization defines it. That's the way I see. Courtney, your take, please.
Yeah, I really like your thoughts, Dishi, on those invisible things that absolutely influence and can be measured across the culture. Things like language patterns and the words we use, I think, absolutely play a role in shaping culture and avoiding, those situations of creating cultural debt. I like to think of measuring culture in two ways. There's a quantitative measure. So those are your low-hanging fruit opportunities. Those things like surveys and focus groups and listening sessions, things like that. But then there's also a qualitative category that I like to also kind of bring into focus here. Those are the behaviors that you observe. Those are the words that people are using. Those are the attitudes that people are projecting with their teams and each other. And I think it's the combination of both quantitative and qualitative measures that can give you an overall indication as to what the vibrance of the culture is. One of the things that we're doing to kind of get under the layer, so to speak, is we're exploring what it would look like to actually measure the health and the vitality of our culture with a solution really centered around measuring the cultural health index. In other words, the health of the organization from a culture standpoint. And what we're doing is we're looking at things like how are people referring others that they think might be top talent or good fits for the organization to the organization. How are they engaging? How are they participating outside of their day-to-day responsibilities and things like employee resource groups and things like that? So I think it's a combination of both your qualitative and quantitative measures, but those are some ways that we're looking to really measure and assess how healthy we are as an organization.
Yeah, and especially as Courtney, talks about those measures, how can those metrics be integrated into a traditional corporate reporting structure?
Oh, interesting question, Alicia. Let me take a stab at it. I recall a recent conversation with a senior executive that was leading a media product, comparing between two organizations he has worked on. The very similar product that he was building in a previous organization versus his current organization. And he said the difference between both the budget required to execute and deliver this product is 10x. And one organization, it was taking 10 times lesser to do the same, develop the same product. And my question was why? And his answer is he effectively said that's a culture at play. The team that had a trust, alignment, psychological safety, and that drive towards the mission made the difference. And he said it's a 10x difference. So thereby, I personally think we need cultural balance sheet, a standard way to track long-term enabler of performance, integrating cultural health metrics into governing reports will help stakeholders to see the risks before they become results. Courtney, over to you.
Thanks, Doshi. I think that's a really excellent point that you mentioned about cultural debt. I like to think of cultural debt in terms of balancing what we do with how we do it. And I think oftentimes when organizations find themselves in a cultural debt situation, it's a result of over indexing on the skills a person brings, the technical capability or know-how that someone has over their behaviors, their mindset, their attitude. And I think that's oftentimes what gets an organization into trouble and creates a compounding effect.
For the better or the worse, when those behaviors are misaligned with the company's core values, when those attitudes aren't reflected in what the organization stands for, when it's misaligned with the culture. And I could think of an example earlier in my career when I was pretty early, just starting out, just really establishing myself. And I was in a situation where I had this manager at the time, and I use that word manager very deliberately because it was a management kind of tactic, not a leadership skill. I would separate them as, where this manager would just berate me. Just every time I would go into his office for a weekly one-on-one updates, whatever it was, would just yell and loud scream, all of those types of things that were very unbecoming of the organization's culture. And when I reflect back on that moment, that individual was probably brilliant in what they brought to the table, probably had exceptional technical skills or a very unique ability. But where they were lacking was their cultural alignment. And when I look back at that situation, it was so misaligned with the organization's culture. It makes me believe that somewhere along the way, someone looked the other way and they over-indexed on the individual's skills and abilities versus how they conducted themselves. And the feeling that creates when you have someone that is just so misaligned with the culture, that creates almost a toxicity in the culture. It just has such a compounding effect that I remember it to this day, and that was years ago.
Courtney, having worked with you, if you want to give me this manager's number.
Happily.
And as we're talking about leaders, we kind of started about leaders, and then Courtney, you just had like your example of how you felt with your manager who was supposed to be a leader, and maybe you didn't feel that way. But as leaders, what role do you and others play in managing and preventing that cultural debt? I guess what role would you have wanted that manager to play, or what roles within any organization?
Yeah, I think looking back at that moment, I think leaders have a responsibility to create the conditions where cultural equity can be built. And when we draw the parallel between cultural debt, cultural equity with kind of a financial balance sheet, it's what are leaders doing? What are we doing? And everyone's a leader in an organization, but what are we doing to create those conditions where everyone feels a sense of ownership? Everyone has a stake in the health and the vitality of the culture. Everyone has a role to play. So I think simple things like leading with empathy, listening, creating those psychologically safe conditions that Dushi alluded to earlier, I think all go a long way to preventing cultural debt and conversely building cultural equity in the organization.
Spot on.
Yeah,
Spot on.
a great answer for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, spot on, Courtney. When you were saying your example, I was also thinking about, right? I'm fortunate to be part of Quest Global for almost 25 years, and I call it as a sort of a culture lab. When since we solve toughest engineering problems by building very global teams, and also we bring in number of teams through M&A and integrate them, so you will end up working with many cultures and many diverse thoughts, and that's a true strength of building teams. So when I often reflected how these teams interpret the same inputs very differently, arriving at entirely different hypotheses and make different choices and take different actions. And these experiences sparked a deep curiosity of how these fundamental templates are formed in these performing teams. So getting to the leadership role, if there is a one thing that I can tell is that building that emotional environment for the team, of that culture of safety, and building that shared purpose or shared mission goes a very long way. And I couldn't agree with you more on empathy to listen, communicate with compassion, and building that bonds. So great points, Courtney.
And then, so what are some of those common, kind of cultural shortcuts, that organizations take that, or what is that long-term impact?
Well, yeah, I'll go with few because I have taken some of these shortcuts and and learned in a very hard way. So I'll tell a few of them. Okay, one, hiring for speed over fit. Right, when you go on having a requirement, you are trying to hire for this functional expert, technology or a knowledge or a functional expertise, right? Mm-hmm. And we go and look at them and we find somebody who may be functionally great, technically great, but may not be fit culturally, right? And we will end up hiring for the speed, saying in to fill the short-term gap and get over the short-term needs. We will end up making a choice. I made the choice of hiring, and then over time it creates a lot more challenges. if we don't address and integrate culturally. And second thing is being polite and versus kind, right? And it involves showing empathy, compassion, and a genuine concern, and giving direct feedback as a thinking partner. And sometimes if you don't do, and I think it builds uh, culture debt, and weighs over the time. And also the success theater, especially if you are not surrounded by capable people with the diverse thoughts, you will not have any disagreements. When you come up with any hypothesis, any conversation, if you don't have any disagreements, then the chances is that you have a success theater, which means there are no honest feedback loops, especially to the top. And you will have a bigger cultural issues in that context. Over to you, Courtney.
Yeah, terrific thoughts, Dashi. When I think about this, I'm transported to a moment in time earlier in my career where I had the opportunity to, give a presentation. It was, I guess, looking back, a pretty high stakes presentation. And, you want to do your best job. You want to do your best possible work in those moments. And I remember I had finished the presentation. I had exited the room. And one of the senior leaders that was in the session as a participant walked up and just gave me a high five. Just a simple gesture. She probably has no recollection that she did it or the moment or the circumstance. But I'm transported to that moment in time because I remember how I was made to feel in that moment. And there's a quote by Maya Angelou that talks about people will forget about what you did, what you said, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And it's one of those moments that will always live with me. And it makes me think that to create cultural equity in an organization, to create that sense of ownership, to avoid cultural debt, there are simple, everyday things we all can do as leaders to build that sense of equity and ownership in the culture with our people and each other. Starting meetings with, hi, how are you? Before just diving in. Getting to know people as people first, and of course, what they bring and skills and all of that secondarily. I think all of those things go a long way to building cultural equity in an organization.
I love starting those meetings with a take two for culture. And really just, recognizing either a piece of the House of Quest Global or, most recently the 25 years of learning. And I'm not sure I'm sure, you have read those, but it's just so, inspiring to hear people's takes on that. And that take two, sometimes even if you're, like proud of yourself, you're like, that's a take two for me, it's a take two for the team, and it's a take two for Quest Global as a whole. So I understand what you're saying there in those openings. And then, so, like when you're thinking about some of the practices that, have been successful in organizations, Dashi, have there been any that you have seen successful organizations implement to kind of maintain that cultural health while scaling?
Absolutely. And Elisha, you touched upon it, in your talk. So successful organizations don't just preserve the culture, but they evolve it. And one thing that you talked about is this 25 principles, and codifying and reinforcing these principles is very essential, right? This is defining those non-negotiables. How do you think about it with the stories of actual examples and the rituals to keep them alive actually comes very handy during crisis, and helps you take calls and make choices during the difficult situations. And also, as we talked, I think hiring for the cultural contribution is a very important aspect of building it, and continue to use the listening systems, right? And more importantly, what I found is promoting that speak up culture is very essential that successful organizations implement. Over to you, Alicia.
Yeah. So Courtney, how might like that concept of cultural debt influence maybe investor relations and corporate valuations in the future?
Oh, it absolutely has an impact on all of those things. And just to build on what she said briefly, I think it requires conscious effort. It requires a measure of intentionality in building cultural equity in the organization. It doesn't happen by chance. So I think it requires all of us to really contribute to it and do so in a very conscious way. And I think when we avoid doing that, as Dushi talked about earlier, it has this tendency of creeping into the organization in some very unsuspecting ways. And you'll see cultural debt reflected in people processes like who we hire, who we promote, who's recognized. And it's seemingly the little things, but it's the compounding effect over time that really adds up to a situation where cultural debt becomes an issue. From an investor standpoint, I think it's not that different from people that are considering organizations as an option. People not only want to know what they're going to be working on, but they want to know who they're going to be working with, what the environment is all like, what is the culture of the organization.
Yeah.
And I think when organizations are conscious about building cultural equity, are conscious about wanting to avoid those situations where cultural debt even becomes an issue, I think there's a measure of intent. There's a measure of intent there. So that's what I would say. And I think people look for that stability in situations. They look to join healthy, well-functioning environments, and culture underpins all of that.
Yeah. And then so what can organizations do then to create, cultural equity amongst employees then?
I would say first and foremost, look at your policies, look at your practices. And I think those oftentimes are an indicator as to what the health and the vibrance, the vitality of the organization's culture is. I would also look for those opportunities to create ownership among people in the organization. Get people involved. Give them a stake in helping to shape and influence and drive the culture. And that can take many different forms, but get people involved, create those opportunities. I think as leaders in the organization, and again, we're all leaders in the organization, we have a responsibility to create safe spaces. Dushi talked about the importance of psychological safety. That starts with us as leaders.
Yeah.
That starts with how we listen, how we talk to each other. What do we do when a team member or when a colleague makes a mistake? So I think all of those things, seemingly little, over time, either build up an organization's culture or could absolutely damage it over time.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And then, kind of going off that again, like Dushi, how do cultural assets kind of help with the longevity of an organization?
Yeah, that's a deeper topic, Elisha. So longevity, it reminds me that what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. And when I think of longevity, it is more than surviving a crisis. It is about how you emerge from it. We all have experienced the challenge of COVID pandemic and how devastating it was. And during that time at Quest Global, we had a year of revenue degrowth, second time in the history of Quest Global. And in such a crisis and revenue growth, and when I look back and reflect on the choices made by the leadership team, and how you respond to crisis, and these are all guided by those cultural assets or the principles of the organization, which helped us now to scale to $1 billion organization. And especially during that time, I still remember, it was Ajit Prabhu, CEO of Quest Global, decided to invest in leadership. And by the way, if I recollect, Courtney, the culture department was stood up, and during the time of a crisis, and we have built new capability, I wasn't sure back then if that was the right thing to do, right? And when I look back and see how it evolved, and those are all the choices guided by the cultural assets and aligned to the principles. So in business, these strong cultural assets become your greatest strength, pulling through difficult time, especially these kind of crises, and helps to have that cohesiveness and decisive action with the faith that you will prevail and the best of Quest Global is yet to come. And if I zoom way out and think about it, the quote of Albert Einstein, everything that can be counted doesn't necessarily count, and everything that counts cannot necessarily be counted. Reflecting on those words, these are actually reminder for all of us, especially in leadership. Don't let measurable distract you from what is meaningful. The performance and purpose are not at odds. They are partners. One guides you and other grounds you.
That was great, Dashi, and very, very profound. And then, so I really, this has been amazing. I really appreciate being asked to be here today. And Dashi and Courtney, thank you for sharing, kind of the what of cultural debt, and how an organization and leaders and really what everyone, can do to create cultural equality and avoid cultural debt. And Dashi, I love that you quoted Albert Einstein, who also says that, in the middle of every difficulty lies opportunity. And you both have shared so many opportunities for those challenging obstacles. So I really appreciate you both being here today.
Thank you.
And we could talk about this another 2 hours, right?
Thanks so much,
Yeah.
Alicia. Pleasure.
So I hope both of you enjoy the rest of your day.
No, thank you.
You too.
All right. Thank you.